my darling, darling boy. Then did that poor woman dream that the house was burnt down? Asked Ewan some quarter of an hour later, gazing at Miss Cameron in perplexity, as she planted before him, ensconced as he was in the easy chair in her bedroom, the last components of a large repast. For allow him to descend and eat downstairs she would not. Indeed, after the first questions and emotions were over, she was for hustling him up to the attics and hiding him there. But, Ewan having announced with great firmness that he was too lame to climb a stair that was little better than a ladder, she compromised on her bedchamber for the moment, and, with Marsally's assistance, brought up thither the first really satisfying meal which Ewan had seen for more than 3 months. In answer to his question she now began to laugh, though her eyes were still moist. The house was set fire to in a way. Eat, Eoin, for you look starving, and you shall hear the tale of its escape. Ewan obeyed her and was told the story. But not yet having, so it seemed to him, the full use of his faculties, he was not quite clear how much of the house's immunity was due to chance, to connivance on the part of the officer commanding the detachment sent to burn it, and to the blandishments of Miss Cameron herself. At any rate, after searching, though not plundering, the house of Ardroy from top to bottom, for whom or what was not quite clear to Ewan, since at that date he was safely a prisoner at Fort Augustus, firing about half the crofts near, collecting what cattle they could lay their hands on, the most having already been sent up into the folds of the mountains, and slaying a dozen or so of Miss Cameron's hens, they had piled wood against the front of the house, with what intention was obvious. It was a moment of great anguish for Miss Cameron. But the soldiers were almost ready to march ere the fuel was lighted. And as they were setting fire to the pine branches and the green ash boughs the officer approached her and said in a low voice, "Madam, I have carried out my instructions and it is not my fault if this wood is damp. That's enough, Sergeant, 'twill burn finely. Column, march." Directly they were out of sight Miss Cameron and Marsally, the younger maidservants and the old gardener, seizing rakes and brooms and fire irons, had pulled away the thickly smoking but as yet harmless branches. And then I bethought me, Ewan, that 'twould be proper there should be as much smoke as possible, to convince the world, and especially the redcoats, should they take a look back. A house cannot burn, even in a spot so remote as this, without there being some evidence of it in the air. So we made a great pile of all that stuff at a safe distance from the house and, my grief, the trouble it was to get it to burn. Most of the day we tended it, and a nasty thick reek it made, and a blaze in the end. That's how the house was burnt. What ails you, my bairn? But this time Ewan was able hastily to dash the back of his hand over his eyes. He could face her, therefore, unashamed, and reaching out for her hand, put his lips to it in silence. Chapter 3 Not infrequently in the past had Miss Margaret Cameron animadverted on the obstinacy which lay hidden, as his temper was hidden, under her nephew's usually gentle speech and ways. And now, at the greatest crisis in his life, when that life itself might hang upon his prudence, poor Miss Cameron was faced in her young relative with a display of this quality which really distracted her. On that joyful and wonderful morning of his return she had allowed him, she put it so, to retire to his own bed in his own room just for the once, the garrets, the cellar or abode on the Braeside being designated as his future residences. Ewan did not argue, indeed he was not capable of it. He fell into his bed and slept for 14 hours without waking. Once he was there, and so obviously in need of rest and attention, Miss Cameron had not, of course, the heart to turn him out, but she kept a guard of young Macmartins and others round the house ready to give tongue in case of a surprise, and promised herself to banish the returned fugitive to more secluded regions directly he was able to leave his room. But when, after 3 days, Ewan did so, it was not to retire into this destined seclusion. On the contrary, he began at once to limp about, acquainting himself with what had happened to his tenants in his absence, trying to discover the fate of those who had never returned, among whom was Lachlan MacMartin, visiting the nearer crofts in person, and interviewing the inhabitants of the farther at the house. Presently, he said, he would take to the heather, perhaps, but, as his aunt could see, he was yet too lame for it, and, as for the garrets or the cellar, he was just as safe in his own bedchamber as in those uncomfortable retreats. Yielding on this point with what she hoped was the wisdom of the serpent, Miss Cameron then returned to a subject much nearer her heart, Ardroy's departure for France or Holland, which he would attempt, she assumed, as soon as he could hear of a likely vessel and was fit to undertake the journey to the coast. France? Queried Ewan, as if he had heard the suggestion for the first time. It was the 5th evening after his return. Miss Cameron was sitting knitting in the long parlour, and he stretched in a chair opposite to her. The windows were closely curtained, and young Angus MacMartin and a still younger brother prowled delightedly in the avenue, keeping watch. France, Aunt Margaret? What put that into your head? Miss Cameron laid down her knitting. Because you cannot stay here, Ewan. And France is in my head rather than Holland or Denmark, because, well, surely you can guess, because your wife is there. Ewan got out of his chair and limped to one of the windows. I am not leaving Scotland at present, he said quietly, and drew aside the curtain. We need not therefore discuss the claims of one country over another. You cannot mean to stay here at Ardroy. Ewan, are you daft? And, in the name of the good being, don't show yourself at a lighted window like that. 'Tis so light outside that the candles do not carry, returned her nephew. Indeed, but for Miss Cameron's prudence they would not have been sitting thus curtained, but in daylight. Moreover, no one will come to look for me here. The house has been burnt, he went on, using the argument he had already used half a dozen times. And he continued to look out. At least Margaret Cameron thought that he was looking out. In reality he had his eyes shut, that he might not see Alison's face, a vain device, for he saw it all the clearer. His aunt was silent for a moment, for he had implanted in her mind a most disturbing doubt. Well, she said at last dryly, I should think that if Major Wyndham, to whom you owe so much, knew of this freak of yours, he would regret the sacrifices which he had made in order to save you, when this is the use to which you put your liberty. I think Major Wyndham would understand, said Ewan rather shortly. Understand what? There was no answer. Then I doubt if the ghost of poor Neil, who died for you, or of Lachlan, would understand. Ewan turned at that, but stayed where he was. Poor Neil indeed, may his share of paradise be his, he said in a softened tone. And Lachlan, too, if he be dead. Since you speak of my foster brothers, Aunt Margaret, and reproachfully, then you must know that this is one reason why I do not wish to leave Ardroy, because it shames me to take ship for France myself and desert those others who cannot flee, for whose fate I am responsible. Moreover, I have started the rebuilding of the burnt crofts, and trust a man to think that he is the only being who can oversee anything practical. I wonder, observed Miss Cameron, how much of rebuilding and repairs I have not ordered and supervised when you were nothing but a small wild boy, Ewan, falling into the loch and losing yourself on the braes above it. He hobbled over to her. I know, I know. No laird ever had a better factor than you, Aunt Margaret. Miss Cameron's knitting slid to the floor. Had. I'm getting an old wife now, 'tis plain, that you dare not leave the reins to me for a year or so, while you take your head out of the lion's mouth for a while. No, no, you know that's not my thought, said Ewan, distressed. I'd leave Ardroy to you as blithely as I did a year ago. I will so leave it presently. That you will do presently, but not by your own will. You'll go off from this door as you left Fort Augustus a week ago, tied on a horse again, and your father's house really in flames behind you, and all because you will not listen to advice. You make me out more obstinate than I am, said Ewan gently. Your advice is excellent, Aunt Margaret, but you do not know all the circumstances. That can easily be remedied, said Miss Cameron with meaning. But to that suggestion Ewan made no reply. Miss Cameron turned round in her chair, and then got up and faced him. Ewan, my dear, what is wrong? What is it that is keeping you from getting out of the country? Surely it is not that there is something amiss between you and Alison. Ewan did not meet her eyes. But he shook his head. Alison and I, he began, but never finished. How put into words what Alison was to him? Moreover, that which was keeping him back did stand between him and her, at least in his own soul. Some day, perhaps, I will tell you, Aunt Margaret, he said quietly. But I'd be glad if you would not discuss my departure just now. You have dropped your knitting. He picked it up for her, and Margaret Cameron stood quite still, looking up uneasily at the height of him, at his brow all wrinkled with some pain of whose nature she was quite ignorant, at the sudden lines round his young mouth. She ended her survey with a sigh. And to think that since we cannot get a letter to her, the lassie may be breaking her heart over there, believing that you are dead. Ewan took a step away, with a movement as though to ward off a blow. Then he translated the movement into a design to snuff the candles on the table behind him. After a moment his voice came, unsteady and hurt, Aunt Margaret, you are very cruel. And his hand must have been unsteady, too, for he snuffed the flame right out. 'Tis for your own good, replied Miss Cameron, winking hard at the engraving of King James III as a young man over the mantel shelf in front of her. Ewan relighted from another the candle he had slain, saying nothing, and with the air of one who does not quite know what he is doing. At least, I'm sure 'tis not for mine, went on Miss Cameron, and now, little given to tears as she was, she surreptitiously applied a corner of a handkerchief to one eye. You cannot think that I want you to go away again and leave the house the mere shell of emptiness it is when you are not here. Ewan looked round and saw the scrap of cambric. In an instant, despite the pain it cost him, he had knelt down by her side and was taking her hands into his, and saying how sorry he was to grieve her, and assuring her that there was nothing whatever wrong between him and Alison. Yet even then he made no promises about departure. Nor had he made any a week later, when, one hot afternoon, he lay, reflecting deeply, on the bed in his own room, with his hands behind his head. Although his wounded leg was already much stronger, it rebelled with effect against unremitting use all day, and to Ewan's intense disgust he found it imperative to spend a portion of the afternoon thus. He regarded this necessity as not only burdensome but disgraceful. The wind soughed faintly through the pines of the little avenue, and then passed on to ruffle the ivy outside his open window. A little brown, some of them, after their fiery ordeal, the topmost of those tough leaves were still there, and made just the same rustling noise as of old. And there Ewan lay, apparently at peace, back in his own room, among his modest possessions, his life and liberty snatched from the enemy, his home unharmed after all, and over the seas his young wife waiting for him in safety, the call of the sword no longer keeping him back from her, since the sword was shattered. But he was by no means at peace, there was unceasing war in his breast. The way to Alison was barred by a spectre which he could not lay. It was in vain to tell himself that, by God's mercy, his most unwilling lapse at Fort Augustus had done no harm, that no one of his own party knew of it, that it was not even a complete revelation. To his acutely sensitive Highland pride the mere fact of the betrayal of his chief's trust was agony. Allison could not heal that wound, which, now that Ewan was back again in his old surroundings, almost in his old life, seemed to have broken out bleeding afresh. There was only one man who could draw the poison from it, and Ewan knew neither where he was nor how he could come at him. And meanwhile his dreams were full of Allison, and a night or two ago he had even seemed to hear her voice in one, asking in so pitiful and faint an accent why he delayed to come to her, now that honor no longer forbade it. She was so lonely. Ewan sighed deeply, and withdrew his hands from beneath his head. The double scar on his right palm caught his eye for an instant. He wondered, not by any means for the first time, whether Wyndham had heard of his escape. If he had, he would know that he had indeed given him his life, yes, even by his refusal to witness against him, since that was the direct cause of the prisoner's being taken over the Spian, where he had met and seized his great opportunity. To judge by the Englishman's palpable distress at their farewell interview, Wyndham would be exceedingly glad of the news of his escape. Some day, perhaps, he might contrive to get a letter conveyed to his hands. He would like to tell him in person. But he was never to see him again, so it seemed, for the 5 meetings were over. Again he counted them, here, at Edinburgh, on Bean-Low, at Fort Augustus. And suddenly his pulse quickened with pleasure that made 4, only 4. No, of course, there had been 2 at Fort Augustus. Yet what, save his own recapture, stood now in the way of their meeting again some day? But the ivy leaves went on rubbing their hands together, and through the window at the other side of the room came the clucking of Miss Cameron's remaining hens, drowsy sounds both, and Ewan, pondering this question, began to fall asleep. Yet, just before he lost consciousness, there shot through his mind, apparently from nowhere, a last flicker of Angus's prediction of a year ago, something about twisted threads, a thread of one color and a thread of another. It had meant nothing at the time and he had totally forgotten it since. Now, between the two worlds of sleep and waking, it not only came back to him, but, with the curious pictorial clarity sometimes vouchsafed in that state, he seemed to see what it meant. Then picture and meaning faded, and he slept. He slept quietly for a while, and then dreamt that a man had come into the room and was standing looking down at him. Yet somehow he knew that it was not a dream, that there was really someone there. He tried to rouse himself, but could not, and then the man laid a hand on his wrist. And at that, still half in a dream, he began to struggle and to speak. "Let go my arm, you damn torturer. No, not if you cut me in pieces. Ah, my God, but there's another way, another way." The hand had left his wrist quickly, and now it was laid on his shoulder, and a voice, Lochiel's voice, said, "Ewan, wake up. No one is hurting you." He woke instantly, crying, "Donald." Donald, half sure, all the time, that it was but a dream. Then he caught his breath and lay staring upwards. It was not indeed Lochiel, but it was his brother who stood there, looking down at him with a good deal of attention. "Archie," he gasped in the most complete astonishment. "You here? Why? Don't you think you would be the better of a doctor, my dear Ewan?" inquired his cousin cheerfully. "That is why I am here." "But there's a price on your head," protested Ewan. "You should not have come here." Archibald Cameron smiled his gentle, quizzical smile and sat down on the bed. "I understand from Miss Margaret that you daily affirm the house of Ardroy to be perfectly safe. Moreover, one does not dictate to a physician, my dear boy, how and when he shall visit his patients. I heard how you escaped as you were being carried to Fort William, and I did not believe that it was your body which was found some days after in one of the pools of Spion. You do not know, perhaps, that that is what has been given out at Fort Augustus. But I guessed that that same body needed attention, so, being yesterday in Glendessery, I made my way hither. Now, let me look at those wounds of yours. And, though Ewan protested that these were quite healed and that he was only a trifle lame, Dr. Cameron insisted. The extent of the lameness, very patent when he made the young man walk about the room, evidently displeased him. When you get to France, Ewan, you must have the care of a good surgeon. I greatly fear that an important muscle in the thigh has been severed, but with proper treatment it may reunite again. I suppose you have been talking to Aunt Margaret, remarked his patient, sitting down upon the bed. But, as I have told her, I am not going to France yet. The muscle must reunite at home. Archie looked at him keenly. He had been talking to Aunt Margaret. I am not advising France solely in the interests of your lameness, Ewan. Well, I know that. But I shall stay in Scotland for the present. Until you are captured again, I suppose, said Dr. Cameron, crossing one leg over the other and leaning back against the post at the bottom of the bed. But I do not know on what grounds you assume that you will have so lucky an escape a second time. Oh, I shall not be captured here, said Ewan carelessly. And when I can walk a little better, I shall very likely take to the heather for a while like you. And as Archibald Cameron raised his eyebrows he said with more warmth, My God, Archie, I'd rather skulk inside of Loch Nah with nothing but my plaid and a handful of meal, even were there a redcoat behind every whin bush, than lie in the French king's bed at Versailles. No doubt, responded his cousin, unmoved. And so would I. Yet I shall certainly make for France if God will when my tasks here are done. I hope indeed that it may not be for long, who knows, but next year may see another and a more successful effort, with support from the French. The prince, yes, indeed, said Ewan eagerly. What of the prince? My last news of him was from a fellow prisoner at Fort Augustus, MacDonald of Kingsburg, who, though he is Sleat's factor, brought him to his own house in Skye disguised as the maidservant of one Miss Flora MacDonald, and was arrested in consequence. I heard much from him, and laughable some of it was, too, for Kingsburg's wife and daughter seemed to have been frightened at the queer figure that His Royal Highness made in his petticoats. But you will have later news of him, Archie. The prince was at the end of July in Glenmariston, said Dr. Cameron, but he is now, I think, in Chisholm's country, farther north. There is so plainly a providence watching over him that I have no doubt he will be preserved from his enemies to the end, and it is therefore the duty of his friends to preserve themselves, too. Yes, I am going to read you a lecture, Eoin Wire, so you had better lie down again. I shall not begin until you do. He waited until Ewan had grumblingly complied, and then began, ticking off the points on his fingers. Imprimus, you stubborn young man, there is this house, almost miraculously preserved from destruction, and, if you keep clear of it, likely to continue immune. There is your good aunt, who can well continue to look after it, but who, if you are found under its roof, will certainly be driven out of it and very possibly imprisoned. You are not on the list of attainted persons, and you have the advantage at this moment of an official report declaring you drowned. Most of all, have you not someone already in France who is breaking her heart for a sight of you? Lying there, Ewan changed color perceptibly, and it was only after a moment that he answered, There are broken hearts in plenty, Archie, in Lochaber. But I do not see, my dear lad, how they are to be mended by your offering up the fragments of Alison's and your own. Ewan uttered a sound like a groan, and, twisting over, buried his face in the pillow, and presently there emerged some muffled words to the effect that he longed to go to Allison, but that and then something wholly unintelligible in which the word honor was alone distinguishable. Dr. Cameron looked down at the back of the uneasy auburn head with the affectionate tolerance which one might display to the caprices of a younger brother. "No, Ewan, to my mind honor points to your going and duty and common sense as well. You cannot help your tenants by remaining here. Miss Cameron can now do that much more effectively so long as you do not compromise her by your presence. You cannot help the cause or the prince, you cannot help Lochiel." The head gave a sudden movement. "He is for France with me when the opportunity comes. Another day that is a different tale, but 'tis likely there will never be another day for you if you persist in remaining here now. And there is another point, which I hope you will pardon me for mentioning. Is your wife going to bear you a child, Ewan?" "How do I know?" answered Ewan in a stifled voice from the pillow. "Our happiness was so short and I have had no letter." "Then, before you throw your life uselessly away," said Archibald Cameron gravely, "it is your duty to make sure that there will be a son to follow you here, Mac Ic Alien. Do you wish your ghost to see strangers at Ardroy?" No Highlander could ever affect to disregard that argument, and Ewan remained silent. "And Allison, do you suppose that she found her wedded happiness any longer or more satisfying than you did?" "God knows, my dear Ewan, I hold that neither wife, children, nor home should stand in a man's way when duty and loyalty call him, for, as you know, I have turned my back on all mine, but when duty and loyalty are silent, then he does very wrong if he neglects those ties of nature." And on that Archibald Cameron, conceiving that he had preached long enough, got up from the bed. Ewan was still lying with his face hidden. Was there something on his mind, as Miss Cameron affirmed? The doctor went and looked out of the far window, and saw the lady in question scattering meal to her hens. "Archie," came from the bed after a moment or two, "if I go, it is only on one condition, which you can grant." "I," said Dr. Cameron, turning round, rather surprised. Ewan had raised himself onto an elbow. He looked oddly pale and strained. "What is the condition, I'll?" "That I see Lochiel first." And over his fair skin there swept a wave of red. It occurred to Dr. Archibald then how strange it was that Ewan, for all his intense devotion, had not yet asked news of his kinsman and chief. But he looked doubtful. "I am afraid that would be difficult, because you are both disabled. You cannot travel to him, nor he to you." "Yes, I had thought of that," said Ewan, now quite pale again. "But I must contrive it somehow." And as Archie was silent, reflecting, he added, with a sharp note in his soft voice, "Is there any other reason why I should not?" "Of course not, save that you will meet in France, please God." "That will not serve. I must see him before I leave Scotland. I know that he is no longer in Lochaber." The short phrases were jerked out, even more so the last one. "Archie, where is he?" Archie was beginning, when unfortunately he heard Miss Cameron calling to him from below, possibly uttering a warning of some kind. He turned sharply to the window and never finished. But on Ewan the effect was of a man who has second thoughts about answering a question, and is not only mute, but turns his back upon the questioner. In his present state of mind, it was quite enough, and next moment, to his visitor's amazement, he had thrown himself off the bed with such violence that he staggered. "I knew it," he exclaimed hoarsely. "You will not tell me where he is because you have heard what I did at Fort Augustus because Lochiel has heard it. I am not to be trusted. That is why you came, I believe, why you want me gone at any price from Scotland." And as Archibald Cameron, already swung round again from the window, stared at him in consternation, Ewan added, clenching his hands, "I'll not go. I'll not be got rid of like that. I'll get myself killed here in Lochaber, the only thing I can do in expiation." And with that he sank down on the side of the bed and hid his face in his hands. Dr. Cameron hastily left the window, but before his amazement allowed him words, Ewan was adding, in a strangled voice, "You are quite right, from your point of view, neither to let me see him nor to tell me where he is. But, Archie, I swear to you by my father's memory that I did not do it willingly. How can he believe that of me?" His cousin stooped and put a hand on his shoulder. "Ewan," he said with great gentleness, "I have not the least notion what you are talking about. What did you do at Fort Augustus?" "Nothing, I'd stake my soul, that your father's son need ever be ashamed of." "You would have let yourself be cut in pieces first, eh?" "I was just on the point of telling you where Lochiel was. He is in Badenoch, hiding in a hut on Ben Alder with Macpherson of Cluny. Now," he sat down and slipped his arm completely along the bowed shoulders, "will you tell me what is on your mind, and why you must see him?" Chapter 4. Thinking it over afterwards, Ewan knew why it had been such a comfort to tell Archie. It was that Dr. Cameron seemed to understand so well what he had suffered that he never tried to belittle the cause of it. Instead of attempting to minimize this, he said that he would have felt exactly the same had such a terrible mischance befallen him. Only how could Ewan at any stage have imagined that Donald, if he heard of his lapse, would ever believe that he had made a disclosure willingly? "I blame you for that, my poor Ewan," he said, shaking his head. "You must surely have known that he would as soon suspect me as you, who have been like an elder son to him, who so nearly threw away your life for him at Fort William. I think that's the worst part of your confession, but as you say that I am not to suppress anything, I must tell him that too, though it will hurt him." Ewan raised his colorless face, to which, however, a measure of tranquility had already returned. "I am sorry for that, but you must not keep back a word. Tell him how I allowed myself to fall asleep when I suspicioned it might be dangerous. Tell him that I insulted Lord Loughton somewhat unworthily. He would not have done that. Tell him everything. You are only a proxy, you know, Archie, though a very satisfactory one," he added gratefully. "There's no other man save Lochiel that I could have told. But I feel as if Ben Nevis had been lifted off me." Archibald Cameron gave his arm a little pressure. "Now 'tis my turn to make a confession to you. When I first came into this room I found myself emulating that Captain Greening of yours, whom, by the way, I should rejoice to meet on some good lonely brae, with a precipice nearby. But, like your talking, my dear lad, my overhearing was accidental." "Do you mean that I was saying things in my sleep again?" "Archie, this is intolerable. You bade me loose your arm when I touched you, and spoke of preferring to be cut in pieces and of another way. You have just told me what that other way was. Ewan, what was the first way, and who took it with you? You have not told me everything, after all." The young man was looking on the floor, and there was color enough in his face now. "I do not very much wish to revive that memory. But if you must know, I was near being flogged by order of the Lowland officer who captured me. He had been going to shoot me first. I'll tell you of that anon. It was because he wanted what they wanted and got at Fort Augustus. No, do not look so horrified, Archie, he did not carry it out, though I'll admit I believed he was going to. It was only a threat." "Then, if it was only a threat," remarked Dr. Cameron, looking at him closely, "why did you call me a damned torturer when I touched you?" "Really, Archie, I cannot be responsible for everything I say in my sleep. I apologize, but if you were worth your salt you would give me some drug to cure me of the cursed habit." I'm afraid the drug does not exist, my dear boy. When your mind is at peace you will not do it any more. And don't you think that it would conduce to that state if you told me why you called me so unpleasant a name? Ewan gave him a little shake. Mo through Ak, Archie Cameron, he said with vivacity, I begin to think it was because you merit it with this persistence of yours. If I said that, I suppose I must have been remembering that when one has had a bayonet through one's arm not long before, it is conveniently sensitive, that is all. But after a few experiments, Major Guthrie found that it was not sensitive enough. They knew better how to do things at Fort Augustus. Archibald Cameron still gazed at him, compressing his lips. So the Lowlander tried experiments, did he? And do you still consider yourself a traitor, Ewan? I'd give you a rather different name, and so, I fancy, will Lochiel. But I don't mean you to tell Lochiel that. No, Archie, that was not confession, you got it out of me unfairly. Unfortunately you made me promise to tell him everything, retorted his cousin, smiling. To turn to another aspect of this matter, then, for Ewan was really looking unhappy, it was, I suppose, to this Major Guthrie with a fancy for experiments that you were betrayed by the English officer who was your prisoner here, I might almost say your guest last August. I hope that he did not go so far as to take part in these proceedings, too. Bless us, what is wrong now? For this partial change of topic had proved far from soothing. With a sharp exclamation Ewan had got up from the bed. Good God, Archie, how did you hear that story? It's not true, Major Wyndham did not betray me, he saved me. Did he? Well, I'd far liefer hear that than the other thing. But that was what Lachlan MacMartin told us, when he came hot food to us at Knackery at the beginning of May. Lachlan went to Knackery, exclaimed Ewan in amazement. Yes, he appeared there one day nearly crazy with rage and remorse because you had been captured while he had left you in order to get food. He wanted Donald to march against Fort Augustus and deliver you. Ewan had begun to limp distractedly about the room. I did not know that. But, great heavens, what a story to get abroad about Major Wyndham. Archie, he saved my life at the last minute. I was actually up against the wall before the firing party when he dashed in between at the risk of his own. I should not be here now for you to bully but for him. It is true that I, too, God forgive me, was deluded enough for a short time to think his goodness calculated treachery, but at least I did not spread it abroad. And that is only part of what he has done and given up for me. He gave his cousin a sketch of the rest. I cannot think how Lachlan got such a mistaken notion into his head, for he was not there when I was found and taken, and he can hardly have met with that scoundrel Guthrie, who is capable of any lie. What has become of Lachlan? Is he here at Ardroy? No, he has never returned, and no one knows anything of him. He has undoubtedly been either captured or killed, and much more probably killed, I fear. But I wish he had not spread the slander. 'Tis at least to be hoped that no word of it reaches poor Wyndham. I like to see in you, Ewan, said his cousin, the same concern for another man's honor as for your own. But you know the Erse proverb, a lie goes but on one leg. Like me, commented Ewan with a smile. Yet you think that in France I may go on two again. You will certainly have a better chance of it. Then I may tell Lochiel, when I get back to Badenoch, that you consent to be reasonable. Yes, thanks to you, I will go since he is going. But I must wait a chance of getting off. There's a chance now, said his cousin quickly, but you must start for the coast tomorrow. Tomorrow. Ewan's face fell. So soon. His glance swept round the room and lingered for a moment on the heathery distances visible through the window. Very well, he said with a little sigh. Tell me what I must do. No, he caught himself up, first tell me a little about Donald. Those wounds of his, are they healed? Archie, I hope due care is being taken of him on Ben Alder. You look as if you think I ought not to have left him, said Dr. Cameron, smiling. But he has had Sir Stuart Threepland of Edinburgh with him, and the wounds are healing, though slowly. And I assure you that I have been too busy following Mercury of late to pay much attention to Aesculapius. I have been to and fro in Lochaber and Moidart a great deal more regularly than the post. More by token I am become a sort of banker. For I suppose you did not hear in your captivity, Ewan, that at the beginning of May 2 French ships landed 6 barrels of gold 40,000 Louis d'or in Moidart for the prince, and with some ado, owing to the reluctance of Clanronald's people to lose sight of it, I got it conveyed to Loch Arkaig, and it has been buried there against future requirements. I know what you are going to say, if only we had had that money earlier, when we needed it so. Those were indeed the words which leapt to the young man's lips. Yet since over the ruined fortunes of today there still danced, like will-o'-the-wisps, the hopes of tomorrow, he fell to discussing the possible uses of this money with the man to whose endeavours, as he soon discovered, it was due that the French had not carried it off again when they heard the news of the disaster at Culloden. Archibald Cameron had indeed played post and banker to some purpose. Ewan looked at him with admiration not free from concern. Archie, are you duly careful of your own safety in these constant journeyings of yours, seeing that you are proscribed by name? His cousin smiled. You may be sure that I am careful. Am I not preeminently a man of peace? Nevertheless, not even Bomarino, the dauntless old soldier, was to make a more memorable end on the scaffold than Archibald Cameron. But his time was not yet, not by 7 years, though, all unknowing, he had just been talking of what was to bring him there, the belated French treasure, fatal as the fabled gold of the river maidens to nearly every man who touched it. Now, for your getting off to France, he resumed. There has lately been a French privateer off Loch Broom, and she may very well be hanging off the coast farther south, therefore you should start for Moidart without a day's delay. Since the 25th of July the coast is not so closely watched for the prince as it was, the cordon of sentries has been removed. Make for Arisaig or Morar, at either you will be able to find a fisherman to take you off at night to the French vessel if she is still there. You speak French, so the rest should be easy. And will Lochiel and the prince try to leave by her? I doubt it, for I fear she will be gone by the time Donald could reach the coast, or His Royal Highness either. But do not delay your departure on that account, Ewan, for the larger the party getting off from shore the more hazardous is the attempt, at least, if there are any soldiers left in those parts now. There cannot, at any rate, be many. Now I must be getting on my way. You will not pass the night with us, suggested Ewan. Aunt Margaret seems to have a high opinion of the garrets as a refuge. Dr. Cameron shook his head. I must push on, 'tis only 5 o'clock. God bless you, my dear Ewan, and bring us to meet again even though it be not in Scotland. I wish I were coming with you to Ben Alder, said Ewan rather wistfully, halting after his visitor down the stairs. Trust me to do your business with Donald as well as you could do it yourself, nay, better, for I suspect that you would leave out certain episodes. You'll be rid of this fellow at last, Miss Margaret, he said to the figure waiting at the foot of the stairs. I've sorted him. 'Tis you have the skill, Archibald Cameron, replied the lady, beaming on him. None of my prayers would move him. You'll drink a health with us before you go. And under the picture of King James III and VIII the three of them drained their glasses to the cause which had already taken its last, its mortal wound. Next day Ewan kept his word, and set about his departure. A garron was found for him to ride, and 2 of his men who had followed him through the campaign were to accompany him to the coast. Yielding to pressure, he had agreed to take young Angus MacMartin with him to France as his personal servant. He could not refuse it to Neil's memory and to old Angus's prayers that a MacMartin should be about him still. He was to leave at dusk, since travelling by night would be less hazardous, and a little before sundown he went up to Sloke Nan Ian to take leave of his foster father, with whom he had had little converse since his return, for Angus had been ill and clouded in mind. But he had borne the loss of his 2 sons with an almost fierce resignation. It seemed as if he had asked no better fate for them, especially for Neil. He had recovered from his illness now, but he was rather frail and still at times a little confused. A daughter looked after him in the old cottage which had once rung with the laughter of many children, and with Ewan's own, but the old man was alone, crouched over the fire, with a plaid across his knees when Ewan, helping himself on the ascent with a staff, arrived at the door. Half blind though he was, Angus's hearing was as keen as ever, and, even with the unfamiliar halt in it, he knew his foster son's step. "Mac, I see alien, is it you? Blessings on your head. You have come to say farewell to me, who shall never see you again." Tremblingly and slowly he arose, and embraced the young man. "Neil and Lachlan shall go with you, son of my heart, that you take no harm before you embark on the great water. Neil is dead, foster father, do you not remember?" asked Ewan gently. "He gave his life for me. And Lachlan, I fear Lachlan is dead also." "It is true that I do not see them any more," replied the old man, with a singular detachment, "for I grow blinder every day, yet I hear Neil's pipes very well still, and when the fire burns up I know that Lachlan has put on a fresh peat for me. Good sons both, but I have between my hands a son who is dearer, though I did not beget him. O my tall and beautiful one, glad was the day when you came back after the slaughter, but gladder this day, for you carry your head out of reach of your foes." He passed his hand lingeringly over the bright locks. "And yet all is not well. I do not know why, but all is not well. There is grief on the white sand, grief and mourning, and a sound of tears in the wind that blows there." "Indeed there is grief," said Ewan sighing, "grief enough in my heart at going, at leaving Alba and my father's house. I was almost for staying, Angus, did I take to the heather, but the brother of Macdonald Duabide has been here, and he bids me go. The chief himself is going." "But we shall return." "Some will return," broke in Angus, sinking his head upon his breast. "Aye, some will return." Sitting there, he stared with his almost sightless eyes into the fire. Ewan stood looking down at him. "Shall I return?" he asked after a moment. "I shall not see you, treasure of my heart. But these eyes will see my own son come back to me, and he too grieving." "But I fear that Lachlan is dead, foster father," repeated Ewan, kneeling on one knee beside him. "Is it not his wraith that puts the peats on the fire for you?" "It may be," answered the old man. "It may well be, for when I speak to him he never answers. Yet one night he stood here in the flesh, and swore the holy oath on his dirk to be avenged on the man who betrayed you to the Sideran Dearg. My own 2 eyes beheld him, my 2 ears heard him, and I prayed the Blessed One to give strength to his arm, for it was then that you were gone from us, darling of my heart, and fast in prison." "But you surely do not mean, Angus," said his foster son, puzzled, "that Lachlan came back here after I was captured? You mean that you saw his tabes? For in the flesh he has never returned to Sloke Nan Ian." "Yes, for one night he returned," persisted the old man, "for one night in the darkness. None saw him but I, who opened to him, and he would not go near the house of Ardroy, nor let any see him but his father, because he was sick with grief and shame that he had left you on being low to the will of your enemy. Ah, Mac I see alien, did I not feel that many things would come upon you because of the man to whom the heron led you? But that I never saw that he would betray you to the Siderean Dirg. May Lackland soon keep his oath, and the raven pick out the traitor's eyes. May his bones never rest. May his ghost Ewan had sprung up, horrified. Angus, stop. What are you saying? That man, the English officer, did not betray me, he saved me, at great risk to himself. But for him the redcoats would have shot me like a dog, but for him I should not have escaped from their hands on the way to Inverloch. Take back that curse, and for heaven's sake tell me that you are mistaken, that Lackland did not swear vengeance on him, but on the man who took me prisoner, a lowland Scot named Guthrie. That is what you mean, Angus, is it not? But Angus shook his grey head. My son swore vengeance on the man who was your guest, the English officer who found you in the boat on Bean Low, and delivered you up, and told the soldiers who you were. Lackland found this out from the talk as he skulked round the Lowlanders' camp in the dark. Vengeance on the Lowlander he meant to have if he could, but he swore it for certain against the other, the English officer, because he had broken your bread. So he took oath on the iron to rest neither day nor night till that evil deed was repaid to him. He swore it here on the Biotag on which you both saw blood that day by the Lochen, and which you bade him not throw away. I think he meant to hasten back and lie in wait for the English officer as he returned over the pass of Carrierick, and to shoot him with the musket which he had stolen from one of the redcoats. But whether he ever did it I do not know. Bewildered, and with a creeping sense of chill, Ewan had listened mutely in order that he might, perhaps, contrive to disentangle the true from the false in this fruit of the old man's clouded brain. But with these last words came a gleam of comfort. No, Lackland had not succeeded in any such attempt, thank God. And since then, for it was in May that Wyndham had returned over the Carrierick, his complete disappearance pointed to but one conclusion, that he was gone where he could never keep his dreadful and deluded vow. Ewan drew a long breath of relief, yet it was rather terrible to hope that his foster brother was dead. Still, he would take what precaution he could. If, when I am gone, Angus, he said, Lackland should return here, charge him most straitly from me that he abandon this idea of vengeance. Tell him that but for the English officer I should be lying today where poor Neil is lying. I wonder if anyone gave Neil burial, he added under his breath. But Angus heard. He raised himself. Lackland buried him when he came there after yourself, Eoin, and found you gone, and was near driving the dirk into his own heart, as he told me. Yes, he stayed to bury his brother, and so when he came to the camp of the redcoats they had taken you to Kilcumane. But all night long he prowled round the tents, and heard the redcoats talk, he having the English very well, as you know, and tried to get into the tent of their commander to kill him while he slept, and could not. So he hastened to Achnacarry, and found Macdoming Ilduabite, and besought him to go with the clan and besiege the fort of Kilcumane and take you out of it, but the chief had not enough men. So Lackland came here secretly, to tell me that he had not been able to stay the redcoats from taking you, and that Neil had been happier than he, for he had died outside the door before they entered to you, and all that was left for him was to slay the Englishman, and so he vowed. But now, it seems, the Englishman is not to be slain. 1,000 times, no, cried Ewan, who had listened very attentively to this recital, which certainly sounded as if it had come originally from Lackland's own lips, and some of which, as he knew from Archie, was true. Remember that, if Lackland should come here, but I cannot understand, he went on, frowning, how, if Lackland overheard so much of the soldiers' talk, he did not overhear the truth, and learn how Major Wyndham ran in and saved me from being shot. Surely that is the matter which must most have engaged their tongues, and in that there was no question of delivering me up. I do not know what more my son heard, said Angus slowly, but, when a man hates another, does not his ear seek to hear the evil he may have done rather than the good? Yes, I suppose he did hate Major Wyndham, said Ewan thoughtfully. That was the reason then he wanted a pretext. Indeed, I must thank God that he never got a chance of carrying out his vow. And, from his long absence, I fear, nay, I am sure that he has joined poor Neil. Alas, both my brothers slain through me, and Neil's children fatherless. But Angus Og goes with you, is it not, son of my heart, that he too may put his breast between you and your foes? That he shall never do, thought Ewan. Yes, he goes with me. Give me your blessing, foster father, and when I come again, even if your eyes do not see me, shall your hands not touch me, as they do now? And he guided the old hands to his shoulders as he knelt there. No, I shall not touch you, treasure of my heart, said Angus, while his fingers roved over him. And I cannot see whether you will ever come back again, nor even whether you will sail over the great water away from your foes. All is dark and the wind that comes off the sea is full of sorrow. He put his hands on Ewan's head. But I bless you, my son, with all the blessings of Bridget and Michael, the charm Mary put round her son, and Bridget put in her banners, and Michael put in his shield. Edge will not cleave thee, sea will not drown thee. He had slid into reciting scraps of a Shion or protective charm, but he did not go through to the end. His hands fell onto his knees again, and he leaned back and closed his eyes. Ewan bent forward and threw some peats onto the fire. Tell me one thing, foster father, he said, looking at him again. Even if I never leave the shores of Moidart, but am slain there, or am drowned in the sea, which is perhaps the meaning of the wind that you hear moaning, tell me, in the days to come shall a stranger or a son of mine rule here at Ardroy? Angus opened his eyes, but he was so long silent that Ewan's hands began to clench themselves harder and harder. Yet at last the old man spoke. I have seen a child running by the brink of Loch Nah, and his name is your name. Ewan drew a long breath and rose, and, his foster father rising too with his assistance, he kissed him on both cheeks. Whatever you have need of, Angus, ask of Miss Cameron as you would of me. You are taking away from me the only thing of which I have need, said the old man sadly. Nevertheless, it must be. Blessings, blessings go with you, and carry you safely away from the white sands to her who waits for you, and may my blessings draw you back again, even though I do not greet you at your returning. When Ewan came slowly down the path again, he found himself thinking of how he had descended it last August behind Keith Wyndham, nearly a year ago. The story of Lachlan's vow had perturbed him, but now he saw it in a far less menacing light. Either his foster brother's unquiet spirit was by this time at rest, or the whole thing was a dream of that troubled imagination of the old seers, where the distinction between the living and the dead was so tenuous. Soon he forgot Keith Wyndham, Angus, and everyone. Loch Nah lay before him under the sunset, a sunset so tranquil and so smiling that in its sleepy brightness, which mirrored all the mountains round, the loch seemed to hold the very heart of content. Ewan had the sensation that his heart, too, was drowned there. And by his own will he was saying farewell to loch and mountain, island, and red crag. He remembered how Alison had said that he would be hard put to it to choose between her and them. Was she right? There was a place where for a little there was no bank, but marshy ground, and where the water came brimming into the reeds and grasses, setting them faintly swaying. He went to it, and, stooping with difficulty, dipped a cupped hand into the water and raised it to his lips. Perhaps that sacramental draught would give him to see the scene as bright and sharp in dreams, over there in the land of exile whither, like his father, like all who had not counted the cost, he was going. As he drank there was a loud croak over his head, and, looking up, he saw a heron winging its slow, strong way over the loch towards the sunset. It might almost have been the same heron which he and Allison had watched that evening last summer, when it had seemed to arrive from the western coast like a herald from him who had landed there. Now it was going towards the coast once more, as he, the outlaw, was going, and as his chief and his fugitive prince would soon be going. In a little year, between two flights of a heron seen over Loch Nah, the whole adventure of ruin had been begun and consummated. Well, if one's life remained to one, it was in order to come back some day and renew the struggle. Ewan took off his bonnet. "God save King James," he said firmly, and turned away from the mirrored mountains to take the same path as the heron. Chapter V. The sea fog, Keith Wyndham decided, was worse than the inland mist, thicker, more woolly, more capricious. Yesterday, for instance, one had wakened to it, and all day it had cloaked sea and shore and the wild, tumbled mountains of the rough bounds. Yet towards evening it had suddenly lifted, and the night had been clear and moonlit. But this morning the white veil was down again, and only now, some hours after sunset, was it clearing away. And this was all the more vexatious because in the silver clearness of last night he had distinctly made out a strange vessel, a Frenchman, he was sure, anchored somewhere off the Isle of Rum. But in the day, thanks to that muffling fog, who knew whether she was still off the coast or no? Yet in a few minutes more, when the moon came up from behind the mountains, he hoped to be able to see as far as her anchorage. Meanwhile, followed by his orderly, he rowed slowly along the flat shore in the direction of Morar. One pronounced Morar. No one could accuse Major Keith Wyndham of neglecting Lord Albemarle's instructions. If anything, he went beyond them in his ceaseless vigilance. Quartered himself at Arisaig, he thence patrolled the coast in both directions, from Loch Nan Uamite, the adventurer's original landing place, to Morar of the White Sands on the other, and had his grumbling men out in all weathers, at all hours of the day and night, and for any kind of false alarm. But he spared himself still less than them, taking little sleep and covering miles every day, often on foot. If fatigue, like virtue, were its own reward, then he had that recompense. And so far it was his only one. But at least Keith felt tolerably certain that no fugitives had yet made their escape from his strip of coast, no fugitives of any kind. For, apart from using every endeavor to secure the person of the Pretender's son, he had been instructed to prevent all communication with French vessels, of whom one or two might always be hovering off the coast. These nights, therefore, that this ghostly ship was visible, it naturally behoved him to be extraordinarily vigilant, since it was unlikely that she was there by chance. She was probably hanging about in hopes of taking off the prize that he was after, and he was duly grateful to the moon last night for showing her to him. And surely it was time for the moon to appear now. Keith put his hand impatiently into the breast of his uniform for a little almanac which he carried there, and, encountering a packet which he also carried, was swept at the touch of it away for a moment from shore and ship and moonrise. Having left Fort Augustus for the coast so soon after Ewan Cameron had confided to his care the letter to his wife, Keith had had no opportunity of dispatching it. Moreover, why send that farewell letter now that its writer had escaped? So, not knowing where else to dispose it, he still carried the packet with the lock of hair upon him, a material token of the tie between him and the foe who had captured him a year ago, and had held him in a species of bondage ever since. The thought had never formulated itself so definitely until tonight, but, by gad, it was true. He had been hard put to it to conceal his exultation when, just before setting out from Fort Augustus for Moidart, he had heard of Ewan's escape and disappearance, and this news had, ever since, been a source of the most unfeigned pleasure to him. His sacrifices had not been in vain, they had been well worth the making. He thought of Ewan back at Ardroy, his doing that. Ewan would recognize it, too. He had not failed in everything. And now he pictured Ewan lying hid in the mountains round Loch Nah until the worst of the storm had blown over. He could not imagine him leaving Ardroy unless he were obliged, and surely, not being on the list of proscribed, he could contrive to elude capture in those wilds. His wife would doubtless get news of him somehow, return to Scotland and visit him secretly, and in the end, when the price had been paid by those who had not had his good fortune, and there was for the others an amnesty or some act of indemnity, he might be able to occupy his home again in peace. It had so happened, Keith believed, after the 15. Was then his hope that they should meet again some day so impossible of fulfillment now. It was true that if he himself succeeded in capturing the prince, Ewan would not readily take his hand. However, no need to face that dilemma yet. But, in a sense, every day that the young gentleman was still in Scotland brought nearer the hour when he must try to leave it, and if Lord Albemarle were right in supposing that he would make for the stretch of coast, already familiar to him, he must soon approach the snare laid for him there. And the presence of that unknown ship last night seemed to indicate that the actual moment of that approach was very near. Ah! Now at last he would be able to look for her, for the moon had pushed up over the craggy eastern summits at his back into a cloudless sky. Keith gave his horse to his orderly, and going along a low spur of rock gazed steadily out to sea. The fantastic peaks of Rum were even more unreal in the moonlight than in the day, and the Isle of Ig of an even odder shape. At first he thought that the stranger was gone, and then all at once he saw her, a ghostly bark on the rippling silver. She seemed to be off Morar, and, since some of her square sails appeared to be set, he doubted if she were at anchor, but she was certainly not sailing away. Keith had to make a rapid decision. At Morar he had an officer and 30 men stationed. That, surely, was enough. He could, if he wished, send back to Arisig and bring up some more from there, yet should Arisig and not Morar prove after all the destined spot, and he had denuded Arisig of watchers, he would be undone. Loch Nan-Uamite, the original landing place, was also provided with a quota, but the distance did not admit of bringing any soldiers thence tonight. He returned to his orderly and mounted his horse. "I shall ride on to Morar. Go back to Arisig and tell the captain so, desire him to keep a close watch on the shore, for the Frenchman is lying off the coast again and nearer in than last night." The man saluted and rode off along the rough sandy road, and Keith was left alone with the ship, the moonlight, and his own excited thoughts. Not that he stayed to contemplate any of these, he pushed on at a smart trot for Morar, turning over the question of a boat, without which no fugitive could, naturally, reach the ship. He had temporarily confiscated every boat on this stretch of coast except such as were genuinely needed for fishing, to which he had granted a permit. Even of the owners of these he was not sure, for they were all MacDonald of Clanronald's dependents. It would no doubt have been better to have burnt every one of their craft. Yet even then a vessel could easily dispatch one of her own, at the risk of being fired on. Keith took a last look at the burnished and gently moving expanse of which he must now lose sight, for here the track turned sharply to the right to run round the deep little inlet of Morar. But there was no visible speck upon the sea which might be a boat. And before long he was approaching the shoreward end of the inlet on the rough sandy track of a road, bordered by dense undergrowth, which ran round, a little higher than the level shore, under trees of no great stature. The tide was coming in fast over the dazzling white sands of Morar, snow under the moon, and drowning the little river which tumbled from the wild, deep fresh water loch behind, where Lord Lovat had sought his last refuge. It was so intensely quiet, and the tide was slipping in so noiselessly, that the roar of the double falls was carried very clearly over the water. Reining up, Major Wyndham listened for some sign of the patrol which should be going its rounds from the quarters on the other side of the bay, across the river, and, to his displeasure, could detect none. This on a night when a French ship was off the coast. The men must be got out at once. He touched his horse with the spur and then pulled up again. What was that dark shape down there on the sand? A small boat, and so near the incoming tide that in another quarter of an hour or so it would be afloat. No fisherman could have been so careless as to leave it there, unless it were secured in some way. Brimful of suspicion as Keith was tonight, he had jumped off his horse in an instant, and thrown the bridle over a convenient branch. He knew better than to take the animal plunging into the soft, dry sand of the slope. He was almost up to his ankles himself before he was down. Yes, he was right, the boat was there for no purpose authorized by him. It had only recently been brought there, for it was not made fast to anything. There were oars in it, but no nets or fishing lines. It needed no more evidence to convince him that the little craft had been placed there in readiness to take off some person or persons tonight to the strange vessel. The most lively anger seized Major Wyndham. What was that damned patrol about not to have discovered this? He must certainly gallop round to their quarters without a moment's delay and turn out the lazy brutes. His pulses leaping, he plunged up the yielding sand to the tree-shadowed road, turned to throw himself into the saddle and stood staring like a man bewitched. His horse was gone as if swallowed up. It is not possible, said Keith to himself. I have not been down there 2 minutes. But, evidently, it was possible. Black though the shadows were under the trees, he could tell that they held nothing so solid as a horse. He looked up and down the empty white track, streaked and dappled with those hard shadows. He examined the branch. It was not broken, and the beast could certainly not have twitched his bridle off it. Someone had been watching him, then, and human hands had conveyed the animal away with her. Furious, he began to run back along the road. Its sandy surface was already too much churned up to show any hoof marks. He did not remember passing any crofts as he came. Though a man could hide in the thick bushes on the seaward side, a horse could not be concealed in them. He turned abruptly and went back again, remembering that there was a dwelling or two farther along, between him and the river. If some of these MacDonalds had stolen his horse and hidden it there, by heaven it should be the worse for them. What, however, was of paramount importance now was not the finding of his horse, but the beating up of the patrol with the least possible delay. Yet by the time that he, on foot, could get round to their quarters, or at least by the time that the soldiers arrived on the spot, the boat would probably have put out with her freight. That was why his horse had been spirited away by the ambushed spy in league with tonight's fugitives. Keith set his jaw and cursed himself most fervently for having come alone. The extraordinarily skillful way in which his horse had been made to vanish, joined to the inexplicable lateness of the patrol, only confirmed his conviction that it was the Pretender's son for whom that boat was waiting. Then, at all costs, he must delay its putting out. Could he disable it in some way? Not easily, without tools, but he would do his best. Once more he plunged down the sandy slope. But the boat, though old, was solid. A knife, a sword, could make no impression on those timbers. Keith had a moment of angry despair, then he remembered having seen in one of these craft the other day a plugged hole, designed to allow water to drain out if necessary. Suppose this boat had one. Getting in, he peered and felt over the bottom, and at last, to his joy, his fingers encountered, toward the after end, a rough peg of wood sticking up like a cork. After some tugging he succeeded in wrenching it out, and slipped it into his pocket. He could get his thumb through the hole he had thus unplugged. He leapt out and ran towards the slope again in triumph. One of two things would happen now: either the pretender's son and his companions would discover what had been done, and a new plug would have to be fashioned to fit the hole, which would delay them not a little, or what seemed to Keith more probable, they would launch the boat and pull off without examining it, on which it would almost immediately fill and sink, and its occupants be forced to struggle back at a disadvantage to a shore by that time, it was to be hoped, straitly guarded. Keith was halfway up the slope again when he stopped abruptly, for in the stillness he had distinctly heard voices, low voices at no very great distance. The patrol at last, perhaps. He did not think so. The speakers seemed to be coming along the tree-shadowed road between him and the end of the inlet, the very road along which he was preparing to hasten. A party of Jacobite fugitives would most certainly not allow a soldier in uniform to run past them if they could help it. Was the prize going to slip through his fingers after all? No, hardly, in that unseaworthy boat. But he must perforce let the owners of these cautious voices pass him and get onto the beach before he started for the quarters of the patrol. Had the tide not already been so high he could have cut across the sands and swum or waded the river, but that was out of the question now. He could only go by the road. He looked round for shelter, and slipped cautiously into a high bush of hazel which itself stood in a patch of shadow so deep that he felt sure of being invisible. Not only voices, but muffled footsteps were audible by this time, and presently a man, a fisherman, he thought, ran down the slope towards the boat. He had scarcely passed before it came to Keith with a gust of despair that he had set himself an almost impossible task. Now that the fugitives were already here, before he had even started, he could never get round and fetch the patrol in time, for if the Jacobites were left to embark undisturbed they would discover and repair the loss of the plug. That man down there was probably discovering it now. But there was another way of rousing his dilatory men, for, unbelievably negligent as they were this evening, they could not fail to hear a pistol shot. That would bring them to the place in double quick time, and although to fire would naturally alarm the fugitives, and make them embark with all the greater dispatch, there was gain in that, since if it were not already done they would pretty certainly not discover the loss of the plug. Keith drew the loaded pistol from his belt, but he put it at half-cock only, because he must wait until the party was well past him before firing, seeing that he was only one against he knew not how many. Centuries seemed to pass while he waited, and considered, only to dismiss, the idea of deliberately shooting at the pretender's son with a view to disabling him, for he could not in this light be sure of stopping short at that. His heart beat faster than ever it had done at Fontenoy or Culloden Moor, for this business was fraught for him with issues more momentous than any battle. What happened in the next quarter of an hour would decide his whole future, and no fighting had done that for him. A sudden fall of sand behind him startled him for a moment, but he dared not turn his head to look what had caused it, for 3-4 dim shapes were coming at last out of the shadows above and beyond him, and beginning to descend the slope. The tallest was limping badly, and he was also the principal figure, for the others, he could see now, were only gillies, and one was a boy. Had the pretender's son gone lame in his wanderings? It was quite possible. Or, God of heaven! The sand seemed to swim under Keith's feet. It was not Charles Edward Stewart, it was Ewan Cameron who had walked into his trap, Ewan Cameron who had just limped down past him on the arm of one of the gillies. Ewan, his friend, whom he had thought safely hidden in Lochaber. The bitter disappointment and the disastrous surprise of it overwhelmed Keith, and he stood there stupefied. Once more he had come on a fool's errand, not the first since he had watched the coast. This was Edinburgh over again, but a much more sinister repetition of it. For the net which he had spread for the arch-rebel was not empty, it held a lesser but indubitable prize, a chieftain, Lochiel's kinsman. With a wild sense of being in a net himself, he realized the cogency of the arguments which he had used against Guthrie. If Ewan Cameron was too important to shoot out of hand, he was also too important to let go. And he saw Ewan sent back to the scaffold after all, and by him, tied on a horse again, by his hands. Or, since the boat was holed, and Ewan was lame, he would drown, perhaps. When it sank, the men were already pushing it nearer to the water. Stabbed to alarm by that thought, he stepped almost unconsciously out of his sheltering hazel bush, and stood at the edge of the shadow with some vague notion of shouting to warn Ardroy. No, what he had to do was to fire, and bring the patrol here quickly and arrest him. He was to stop all communication, to allow no one to leave, much less a chieftain and a kinsman of Lochiel's. "God help me," he said aloud, and put a hand over his eyes. There was a sudden crackling of broken stems, a fierce exclamation behind him, something glittered out of the shadow, and Keith swung quickly round just as the man who had been tracking him for over a week sprang down upon him. And so he did not receive Lachlan MacMartin's dirk between the shoulders, as Lachlan had intended, but in his breast. Leaning on young Angus's shoulder by the boat, Ewan watched the Morar fisherman hastily fitting in the spare plug which he had brought with him, because, as he had explained, the redcoats had played the trick of removing one from Ranald Moore's boat the other night. The fates had indeed been kind. No patrol this evening. If they were quick, they would get out of the bay without a single shot being fired at them. The boat was being pushed down to the water when all at once the lad Angus gave a little cry, clutched at his master's arm and pointed up the beach. Ewan, turning his head, saw two men locked together on the sandy slope, saw one drop and roll over, had a dim impression that he wore uniform, and a much clearer one of a wild figure running over the sand towards him with a naked dirk in his hand. Young Angus tried to throw himself in front of his chieftain, but the grip on his shoulder, suddenly tightening, stayed him. Moreover, in another moment the spectre with the dirk was on his knees at Ewan's feet, holding up the weapon, and, half sobbing with excitement, was pouring out a flood of words as hot as lava. "Mac I see alien, I have kept my vow, I have avenged you and saved you, too, though I knew not till the biotag was bare in my hand that it was you who had passed. The Englishman would have betrayed you a second time, but he lies there and will not rise again. Oh, make haste to embark, for there are redcoats at Morar." Despite his disfigured face, Ewan had recognized him at once, and the meaning of his words, for all their tumbling haste, was clearer still, horribly clear. Frozen, he tried to beat that meaning from him. "God's curse on you, what have you done?" he exclaimed, seizing his foster brother by the shoulder. "If you have really harmed Major Wyndham." But the moon showed him the bloody dirk. With a shudder he thrust the murderer violently from him, and, deaf to young Angus's shrill remonstrances, started to run haltingly back towards the slope. Surely Lachlan had mistaken his victim, for what could Wyndham be doing here at Morar? But it was Keith Wyndham. He was lying on his side, full in the moonlight, almost at the bottom of the slope, as if he had been thrown there stunned, perhaps, thought Ewan wildly, with the recollection of how he himself had lain on Culloden Moor, though how a dirk could stun him God alone knew. Halfway down the slope lay a pistol. Calling his name, he knelt and took him into his arms. Oh, no hope, it was a matter of minutes. Lachlan had used that long blade too well. As he was lifted, Keith came back from a moment's dream of a shore with long green rollers roaring loudly under a blood-red sunset, to pain and difficult breath and Ewan's arms. He knew him. I did not have to fire, he gasped, but Ewan could not realize what lay behind the words. Go before they come from Morar, my God, exclaimed Ewan, trying to staunch the blood which that spotless sand was already drinking. Oh, Wyndham, if I could only have warned you if I had known that he was here. There is a hole in the boat, said Keith with increasing difficulty. I took out the plug. They have put in another one they had in readiness. Wyndham, for God's sake try to do what? Your letter is still. I had no Duncan Angus, called Ewan desperately, have none of you any brandy? But his men, who had run up, were intent on another matter. Come, the boat is ready and I think the redcoats are stirring over the river, said Duncan Cameron, laying a hand on his shoulder. Come, Mac I see alien, come. Ewan answered him in Gaelic. I shall not stir while he breathes. But the dying man seemed to understand. Go. Ardroy. I implore you. He began to fumble at one hand with the other, and managed to pull off the signet ring which he always wore, and to hold it out a little way. Ewan took it, not knowing what he did. I was watching for the pretender's son, went on Keith, lower and lower, then I saw it was you and I had to try to decide duty. No, it is just as well. I could not have borne, he sighed and shut his eyes. Ewan held him closer, still trying to stay the flood, and trying, as he knew, in vain. Yet Keith only seemed to be going to sleep. He was murmuring something now which Ewan had to stoop his head close to hear. And then all that he could catch were the words, desire friends always. Yes, yes, always, he answered in anguish. Always. But there would be no always. Oh, if only you had not been in that madman's path. But that, at least, was not fortuitous. Yet to Keith the assassin had only been some man of Morar in league with the embarkation. He reopened his eyes. Your hand. Ewan gave it to him, and saw a little smile in the moonlight. Have you been burying any more cannon? I always liked you, said his enemy clearly, and a moment after, with his hand in Ewan's, was gone to that place where an enemy never entered and from whence a friend never went away. Ewan laid him back on the patched sand, and, getting to his feet, stood looking down at the man to whom the heron had brought him foe, enigma, savior, victim of a terrible mistake. And friend, yes, but it was too late for friendship now. It had already been too late at their last meeting, which had not been the last after all, when he himself, as he thought, was standing on the threshold of death. But it was Keith Wyndham who had gone through that door, not he. Had he known that he was dying? Every word of the few he had spoken had been about him. Then through the haze of shock and grief penetrated the sound of a distant shot, and he remembered that there were other lives than his at stake. Go and hide yourselves, he commanded. But the two Camerons shook their heads. Not until you are in the boat, Mac I see alien. I will come, then, said Ewan. He would rather have stayed, now, but he knelt again and kissed Keith's forehead. And that it should not be found on him, an equivocal possession, perhaps, he drew out his own letter to Alison and slipped it, all sodden, into his pocket. Then he suffered the gillies to hurry him down to the boat, for already it was clear that the soldiers were crossing the river, and some 20 yards away a couple of ill-aimed bullets raised spurts of sand. By the boat was waiting Lachlan who, directly he was recovered from the result of his first attempt by Loch Tarf, had once more set about the fulfillment of his vow, who had hung about Inverness through July and found no opportunity, lost track of his quarry when he went to Fort Augustus, picked it up again in Moidart, and had hardly let him out of his sight since. It was he who had removed the horse. "Ewan, my brother, forgive me, forgive me." Ewan turned on him a terrible face. "Never. You have killed my friend." "Never? Then as well have my life, too," cried Lachlan. The reddened dirk which a year ago he had been moved to fling into the loch spun glinting through the moonlight and splashed into the sea, and its owner, turning, ran headlong towards the road and the oncoming patrol. Soon the noise of shots and shouting could be heard no longer, only the creak of the oars in the rough rowlocks as young Angus and the fishermen pulled hard over the moonlit sea towards the French privateer. But Ewan sat in the stern sheets of the little boat with his face buried in his hands, and cared not that he went to safety. The day would come when, pondering over his memories of those broken sentences, recalling the pistol lying on the sand, he would arrive at a glimpse of the truth, and guess that Lachlan's blade had saved Keith Wyndham from a decision too cruel, and that perhaps he had been glad to be so saved. But he would never realize, how should he, that the tide which for a year had been carrying the Englishman, half ignorant, sometimes resisting, among unlooked-for reefs and breakers, away from the safe, the stagnant dead sea of his choice, had borne him to no unfitting anchorage in this swift death, devoid of thoughts of self. For Ewan saw Keith only as a loser through meeting him a loser every way, whereas in truth he had been a gainer. A hail came over the water, they were approaching the privateer. He tried to rouse himself from his stupor of grief and regret, and from the self-reproach which stabbed scarcely less deep because it was causeless. And as he did so the kind moonlight showed him his friend's ring upon his finger. Epilogue Harbour of Grace, Epilogue Harbour of Grace. The fresh wind scouring the mouth of the Seine kept the fishing boats from Honfleur lying well over, and at the foot of the cliffs of St. Idris the waves were shivering themselves in a joyful welter of foam. Long pennants of cloud streamed and vanished in the blue, all the shipping rocked at anchor, and Alison Cameron, crossing the marketplace of Havre de Grace with a basket on her arm, had to clutch at her black cloak lest it should be whirled off her shoulders. She had reached the French port in time to see her father alive, in time, indeed, to give him nearly 6 weeks of the most devoted care. But in May he died peacefully, ignorant of the catastrophe which had torn forever the webs that he had helped to weave. Since he was ill it had not